The morning sun caught the edge of Sharon Klein's coffee mug as she stood at the kitchen window, watching nothing in particular. 23 years of marriage to Michael had taught her the value of quiet moments before the day demanded her attention. She was a woman of routine. 6:47 a.m., coffee, shower, work by 8:30. The suburban neighborhood of Millbrook Heights had been their sanctuary for the last 8 years. The kind of place where you knew your neighbors' names and waved at block parties, where children played safely and the world felt manageable. The knock on her door at 7:15 a.m. disrupted everything. Sharon opened it to find Pat, HODGKINS, standing on her porch in full HOA regalia. Pressed linen blazer, clipboard, that particular expression of righteous authority that had become Pat's default setting since being elected HOA president 3 months prior. "Good morning, Sharon," Pat said, not bothering with pleasantries. "We need to talk about your landscaping." Sharon's grip tightened on her mug. "My landscaping is fine. The hedges on the eastern property line are overgrown by 6 inches. Section 4.2 of the HOA bylaws specifies a maximum height of 36 inches. Yours are clearly 42 minimum." Pat held up a photograph as evidence, as if she'd photographed Sharon's hedges with forensic precision. "You have 14 days to bring them into compliance, or we'll have to discuss fines." This was their first real interaction since Pat had taken office. Sharon had voted for the other candidate. "Pat, their hedges, they're alive, they grow." "Then perhaps you should maintain them better." Pat smiled with the warmth of a shark. "We're all subject to the same rules. It's what makes our community work." After Pat left, Sharon stood in her doorway for a full minute, anger simmering beneath her skin. She looked at her hedges. They seemed fine, more than fine. They were beautiful, actually, thick and verdant, providing privacy that was increasingly valuable in a neighborhood where everyone wanted to know everyone else's business. That afternoon, she called a landscaper. The estimate was $240. She paid it. 2 weeks later, the hedges had been trimmed to precisely 36 inches. Sharon stood with the landscaper, accepting his invoice with a grimace, when she noticed something odd. Fresh footprints in her mulch bed. Large, deliberate footprints that curved around the edge of her property. She followed them with her eyes. They led from the property line, where Pat's house began, directly toward the back corner of Sharon's yard, where a small gap existed between her fence and the neighbor's garage. Sharon's first instinct was to check the gate. It was locked from the inside, as it had been every single day for 8 years. But someone had definitely been here. The footprints were fresh. The imprint was too deep to be from the landscaper's work. That evening, she mentioned it to Michael over dinner. He was distracted, scrolling through emails on his phone, and barely registered what she'd said. "Maybe it's deer," he offered. "Deer don't wear size 11 shoes." He looked up. "You measured the footprints." "I could tell by looking." Michael returned to his phone. The conversation died. 3 days later, Sharon saw her. She was in the home office on the second floor, filing documents for her work as a contract accountant, when movement outside caught her eye. Through the window that overlooked the backyard, she saw Pat Hodgkins, clear as day, standing inside her fenced yard. Pat was holding something to her face, a camera or possibly binoculars, and was pointing it directly at Sharon's house. Sharon froze. Every rational thought in her head tried to find an explanation. Had the gate been open? Had Michael let her back there for some reason? No, that made no sense, and Pat's posture was furtive, deliberate. She was taking pictures of what? The house, the garden. Sharon moved to the stairwell and practically fell down the steps. By the time she reached the back door and unlocked it, Pat was already moving toward the fence line, walking quickly. Too quickly to be casual. As Sharon stepped outside, Pat heard her and turned, her expression shifting from caught to casual in the space of a heartbeat. "Oh, Sharon," Pat called out, her voice pitched high and false. The neighborhood association is documenting all the properties for our new database. Architectural standards, you know. Just want to make sure everyone's in compliance. Your house looks great, by the way. Love what you've done with the flower beds." Sharon's hands were shaking. "You were on my property." "There's no fence between me surveying from my side of the line," Pat said smoothly. "It's a common area technically, but if it bothers you, I apologize. Just doing my job." "Your job is to manage the HOA. You're not authorized to survey my house." Pat's smile became fixed. "Then I suppose we'll have to agree to disagree about what's common and what's private." She moved toward the fence gate, the same gate that should have been locked, and pushed it open. It swung freely. Apparently, it had never been locked at all. "How did you get in?" Sharon demanded. "Gate was open, dear. I assumed it was fine." Pat left, but she left a mark. Sharon stood in her backyard, hands still trembling, trying to decide if what had just happened was a violation or merely an invasion. The gate, she was certain it had been locked. She was certain of it. That night, she tested it 3 times, locked it, walked away, came back. Each time it was locked. Each time she opened it with her key from the inside, so how had Pat gotten in? The answer came when she examined the gate more carefully. The lock mechanism was old, original to the house, probably, and the frame was slightly warped from years of weather. Someone who knew what they were doing could possibly work it open. Someone with patience, someone with something to prove. Sharon had a new lock installed the next day. Heavy-duty, professional grade, the kind that couldn't be fiddled with. She didn't tell Michael. She wasn't sure why. It felt like if she said it out loud, she'd have to admit how much it bothered her, how violated she felt. But Pat wasn't done. 2 days after the new lock was installed, Sharon noticed the photographs. They were slipped under the front door mat, 5 of them in a neat stack. Each one was a picture of her house from various angles, various distances. Some were taken from the street. Others were taken from positions that shouldn't have been accessible. One was taken from directly behind her property, showing the back of her house in detail. The hydrangea garden, the patio, the spot where she liked to sit and read on Sunday mornings. There was no note, no explanation. Just the photographs, a message without words, a threat without teeth. Sharon showed them to Michael that evening. His reaction was immediate and strong, anger mixed with confusion. "This is insane," he said, fanning through the photos. "This is stalking. We need to call the police." "And tell them what? That Pat took pictures of our house. That she's trespassing and leaving threatening images. Sharon, this is crazy." Sharon wanted to agree with him. She wanted to feel as certain as he sounded. But something in the way the photos were composed, the deliberation evident in their arrangement, suggested this was calculated. Pat was proving a point. She was proving that she could access Sharon's space whenever she wanted, that the boundaries Sharon had drawn were meaningless. The police came the next morning. Officer Rivera, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a measured demeanor, listened to Sharon's full account, examined the photographs, and made notes. But her expression suggested she didn't quite understand the severity of what Sharon was experiencing. "Has she threatened you directly?" Rivera asked. "No, not with words." "Has she damaged your property?" "No, but—" "Mrs. Klein, based on what you've told me, it sounds like Ms. Hodgkins may have taken photos from public property. Even if she did trespass on your property, the fact that she left photographs, while certainly unsettling, isn't technically criminal. It's not a direct threat. I can file a report, and I'll document everything, but unless something escalates, there's not much we can do." After the police left, Sharon felt something settle in her chest, a cold certainty that this was her problem to solve alone. The encounter that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Sharon had taken the day off work, something she rarely did, to wait for the installation of a security camera system. She was sitting on the patio, sipping tea and trying to focus on her book when she heard it, the sound of the gate lock being worked. Not picked exactly, but jostled, tested, moved back and forth with clear intention. Sharon was on her feet instantly. She moved to the side of the fence, careful not to be seen, and peered through a gap in the boards. It was Pat, and she had tools with her, a small crowbar, something that looked like it might be a lock pick. For 30 seconds, Sharon watched her neighbor work on the gate with focused intensity. Pat's face was determined, almost serene. She was so focused on the lock that she didn't notice when Sharon unlatched the gate from the inside and pushed it open. The surprise on Pat's face was worth everything. "I'd like you to leave," Sharon said quietly, "and I'd like you to stop trespassing on my property." Pat straightened, her expression cycling rapidly through shock, indignation, and finally, something that looked almost like satisfaction. "This is a neighborhood," Pat said. "We're all supposed to care about each other, supposed to maintain standards, but you don't care about standards, do you, Sharon? You care about secrets." Sharon's spine went cold. "What are you talking about?" "I've been watching your property, not because I'm interested in your business, but because I care about this neighborhood, and what I've found is very interesting. Especially the eastern corner of your yard, the way you've let it go wild. The way you keep that section off limits. The way there's a depression in the ground there like something's buried. Sharon felt her throat tighten. She'd never told anyone about the depression in the eastern corner. It was something she'd noticed when they first bought the house, a slight sinking of the earth as if something beneath had settled unevenly. She'd had a landscaper evaluate it years ago. He'd said it was probably just subsidence, nothing structural to worry about. She'd let it be, had even added some ornamental plantings to obscure it. It was one of those things you noticed and then stopped noticing. "There's nothing there," Sharon said flatly. "Maybe not, but I'm going to find out." Pat's smile was cold. "I have every right. This is about community standards, Sharon, about transparency, about making sure everyone follows the same rules. You're trespassing right now. Leave or I'm calling the police again." Pat left, but this time Sharon knew it wasn't over. This was personal now. This was Pat convinced that Sharon was hiding something. Which of course she was, but Pat had no idea what. That evening, Sharon stood in the eastern corner of her yard, the section she'd landscaped so carefully, and felt the past press against her like a physical thing. The depression in the ground wasn't subsidence. It never had been. It was a deliberate sinking, a settling of earth above something that shouldn't have been there. Something her mother had told her about decades ago with a voice that brooked no questions. "That part of the property is off limits," her mother had said when Sharon was 12 years old when they'd first moved to Millbrook Heights. "Don't dig there, don't ask about it, don't tell anyone. Some things are better left buried." Sharon had never asked. She'd been obedient in that particular way that children sometimes are, instinctively understanding that some secrets were meant to stay secret. She'd built her life around it. She'd bought this house specifically because it was the family property, because she could keep watch, because she could make sure nothing disturbed what was underneath. And now Pat Hodgkins, with her zeal and her certainty and her need to control everything, was threatening to unearth it all. Sharon made a decision that night. She'd been keeping this secret for 40 years. She'd let it define her relationship with this house, with this land. She'd built her entire life around protecting something she didn't even fully understand. Tomorrow she would dig. She would find out what was really there. And then maybe she could finally understand why her mother had been so afraid. The shovel bit into earth that had been undisturbed for decades. Sharon had waited until Michael left for his business trip to Dallas, a convenient 5 days away, before she began. She'd rented a small excavator under a false name from a company 3 towns over, having it delivered early in the morning with the understanding that the operator would drop it and leave. She had 6 hours before the rental period started its timer. She had 6 hours to discover what her mother had died protecting. The eastern corner of her property had been sealed with careful landscaping, decorative river stones arranged in a specific pattern, flowering shrubs planted at precise intervals, a small granite bench positioned to face away from the spot itself. Sharon dismantled it all systematically, moving the stones, uprooting the shrubs. Underneath was ordinary earth, nothing unusual. But the depression was real, tangible, a shallow bowl in the ground, perhaps 3 feet across at its widest point. The excavator's engine growled to life. The hydraulics hissed. The bucket sank into the earth with mechanical precision. At 2 feet down, the bucket hit something solid. Sharon's heart hammered as she maneuvered the shovel, clearing away the earth carefully now by hand. She'd paid for the excavator. She could take her time. What emerged was not a coffin or a body, but something far stranger. A corner of stone, worn smooth by time and sealed with a layer of lead. She worked faster now, digging around the perimeter of the stone. It took nearly an hour to understand what she was looking at, not a random rock, but the corner of a structure. A roof, a ceiling. There was a building underneath her property, underground, deliberately concealed, with careful attention paid to hiding its existence. The stone was ancient, she could see that much. The lead seal was meant to prevent something. Water, air, investigation. By the time she'd cleared enough earth to see the top of a door frame, her hands were bleeding and her breath came in shallow gasps. The door itself was metal, bronze maybe, corroded green with age. And carved into it, visible now that she'd cleared the dirt, were symbols. Not English, not anything she recognized. Sharon stood back, dirt covering her clothes, blood drying on her palms, and felt the world shift. Her mother had grown up in this town, her grandmother before that. The property had been in her family since before Millbrook Heights existed as a formal neighborhood, since before any of these suburban streets had names, since before anyone had decided to develop this particular stretch of land into what it had become. What had they been guarding? The obvious answer was to call someone, a historian and archaeologist, someone whose job it was to understand old things and make sense of them. But Sharon had spent 40 years internalizing her mother's fear. 40 years understanding that some knowledge came with a price, and she wasn't ready to pay it yet. She refilled the earth. It took 3 hours, working the excavator in reverse, tamping down the soil, smoothing it over. She removed the vehicle before noon, paying the rental company a premium to pick it up early. By afternoon, she was back to filling in the cosmetic damage, replanting the shrubs in slightly different positions, rearranging the stone. By evening, if someone who didn't know what to look for walked past the eastern corner, they wouldn't notice anything unusual. But Sharon knew. Sharon had confirmed it. She called her sister Diane that night. Diane was 5 years older, and she'd moved away from Millbrook Heights in 1998, had never come back. She lived in Portland now, had a different last name, had deliberately constructed a life as far from their childhood as possible. Sharon had always respected that boundary. They spoke maybe 3 times a year, dutiful conversations that never went deep. "There's something I need to ask you," Sharon said without preamble. "Did Mom ever tell you about the property, about something buried here?" The silence on the line was answer enough. "She told you," Sharon said. "No," Diane said quietly. "But I found something when I was packing to leave, a journal. I meant to ask her about it, but she died before I got the chance, and then I was angry and I didn't want to know, and I've just never looked at it." "Where is it?" "In a box in my attic. Sharon, I don't know if you should." "Where is it, Di?" Another pause. "I'll email it to you or mail it. I have to find it first, and I'd rather not handle this alone." Sharon understood then that her sister had been carrying this her entire life, that Diane had run to Portland partly to escape this particular mystery, that their mother's death had been a relief to her in some way, an escape from needing to ask questions that would complicate the life she'd built. "Send it," Sharon said. "Send me everything." The journal arrived 3 days later via overnight mail. It was leather-bound, ancient, filled with handwriting that Sharon recognized as her grandmother's. Her mother's mother, Elizabeth Chen, who had died in 1954 when Sharon was 3 years old. A woman Sharon knew primarily through photographs and family lore. Sharon locked herself in the home office and began to read. The entries were not chronological. Elizabeth had written sporadically in fragments, sometimes years apart. But the earliest entry was dated March 17, 1924, and it began with a question. "What am I supposed to do with what I know?" Elizabeth had been 23 years old. She'd been living in Millbrook, then just a collection of farms and family homesteads, with her new husband, Thomas Chen, who had immigrated from San Francisco, who had helped build the first proper structures in the growing township. They'd had 6 months of marriage, 6 months of happiness, when Thomas had been digging a well on their property and had struck something solid, something that shouldn't have been there. Elizabeth's words came in careful, precise handwriting, describing her husband's discovery, a sealed stone chamber beneath the earth containing items that should not exist in a town established barely 50 years prior, items that suggested occupation, items that suggested history that predated the official history of the land. Thomas had wanted to report it. Elizabeth had asked him not to. She'd been afraid. Of what? Of whom? The journal didn't say explicitly, but there were references to people in town who wouldn't like it discovered, people with power, people with reasons to keep the land's true history concealed. In the end, Thomas had listened to his wife. He'd sealed the chamber back up. They'd never spoken of it again. He'd died in 1948, and shortly after, Elizabeth had written her final entry. "I've kept the secret as Thomas would have wanted, but I cannot bear it alone any longer. I am writing this so that someone will know. Someone will understand that this land remembers what we have tried to forget. I am giving this to my daughter, Margaret, with instructions that she decide whether the truth is worth the cost. I suspect she will choose secrecy, as I have. But perhaps one day someone will have the courage that I lacked." That was where the journal ended. 40 years of silence, then a final cry for understanding that Elizabeth had never lived to see answered. Sharon read the journal 4 times that first day. She read it again the next morning, looking for clues about the structure itself, about what might be inside. Elizabeth had been frustratingly vague, presumably because she was writing in code, afraid someone might find her words. But one passage stood out. T says the symbols are not English, not any language he recognizes. He believes they may be older than the land itself. He wonders if the people who built it are still here in some form or if they vanished centuries ago. I have asked him not to investigate further. Some mysteries are safer left untouched. Symbols, old symbols, unknown language. Sharon spent the next 3 days researching. She found websites dedicated to local history, genealogy records, archaeological surveys of the region. Millbrook Heights had been settled primarily by European immigrants in the late 1800s, with some Native American presence before that. There was nothing, as far as the official record was concerned, that suggested any significant archaeological sites in the area. But unofficial history was another matter entirely. She found an obscure blog post from someone who identified themselves as a local historian named Elenatorres. The post discussed pre-Columbian settlement patterns in the region, suggesting that some areas had been deliberately developed to erase evidence of earlier occupation. The post included a photograph of similar symbols, carved into a stone marker, found in a private collection, origin unknown. Sharon emailed Elena Torres at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, knowing it was probably a dead end, but feeling desperate enough to try. Elena responded within 2 hours, always looking to talk about local history. Where are you? What did you find? She was younger than Sharon expected, probably in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and the kind of energy that suggested she'd been waiting her whole life for a mystery like this. She drove a beat-up Subaru that had seen better decades, and she carried 3 large bags of equipment and reference materials that she set on Sharon's kitchen counter with reverence. So, Elena said, accepting the coffee Sharon offered, you found an underground structure with symbols matching the Mazatic cultural markers. I found something underground. I haven't opened it. I don't know what's inside. Elena's eyes widened. You haven't opened it. My family has kept it secret for nearly 100 years. I'm not sure I have the right to just break that seal. Sharon, if what you're describing is what I think it is, you don't just have the right. You have a responsibility. This could be an intact archaeological site. This could rewrite local history. It could also destroy my family's history. Elena studied her. These aren't mutually exclusive. Truth often complicates family narratives. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, 2 women with different stakes in what lay beneath Sharon's property. Elena wanted knowledge. Sharon wanted to understand why her family had sacrificed so much to hide it. I need to talk to my sister, Sharon said finally. I need to show her the journal. I need to know if she's willing for this to become public. Diane drove up from Portland that same afternoon, the journal already forwarded to her via email. She looked older than when Sharon had last seen her in person, which had been 5 years ago at their mother's funeral. She looked like someone who'd been carrying a burden and had finally set it down. I read it, Diane said, standing in Sharon's kitchen, refusing coffee or water or anything else Sharon offered. I read Mom's notes too. She kept notes, Sharon, in a different journal. She was trying to piece together what Elizabeth had found, but she was too afraid to do it publicly, so she did it alone in private for her entire life. Where are these notes? Destroyed. After Mom died, I went through her things. I found them, and I burned them. I literally took them to the fireplace and burned them because I was so tired of secrets. Diane's hands were shaking. Elena, sitting quietly in the corner, was taking notes. I don't want to know, Diane said. I came here and I'm going to tell you that straight to your face. I don't want to know what's down there. I don't want to be responsible for it. If you want to open it, that's your choice. But I can't be part of it. And I won't judge you whatever you decide, but don't ask me to help. Please don't ask me to help. By evening, Diane had left, heading back to Portland, back to her carefully constructed distance from this place. Before she went, she hugged Sharon longer than they'd hugged in years. Whatever's down there, it wasn't worth what it cost Mom, Diane said. Remember that. The excavator was scheduled for delivery Monday morning. Elena had made calls to colleagues, to university researchers, to people whose job it was to handle archaeological sites. She'd coordinated with a structural engineer to ensure the chamber was safe. She'd gotten permission from the township, using a carefully worded request that suggested they were investigating a potential historical marker, nothing more. Sharon spent Sunday night awake, sitting in the eastern corner of her property, feeling the earth beneath her feet, trying to understand what she was about to unleash. Pat Hodgkins had been unusually quiet for the past week. Sharon hadn't heard from her, hadn't seen evidence of trespassing, but she had no doubt that Pat knew something was coming. Pat, with her certainty and her need to control. Pat, who wanted to expose everything. At dawn on Monday, Sharon made a decision. She called Pat and asked her to come over. Pat arrived within 20 minutes, suspicious and curious in equal measure. "I want to tell you something," Sharon said, standing in her kitchen looking directly at her neighbor. "I'm going to be conducting some excavation work on my property. It's going to take several days. There will be equipment and noise and disruption. I'm telling you first because I respect our community and I want you to be prepared for that disruption. But I'm also telling you, this is my property and this is my business, and I need you to understand that clearly." Pat's face cycled through several emotions. Curiosity dominated. "What kind of excavation?" "That's not your concern, but I wanted you to hear it from me." "Sharon, if there's something wrong with your property structurally." "There's nothing wrong. This is a personal matter, and it's private." Pat left unsatisfied, but she left. Sharon had done what she could. At 9 a.m., the excavator was dropped off. At 9:30 a.m., Alina arrived with her team, 2 graduate students and a professional archaeologist named Dr. James Morrison. At 10 a.m., they began the careful work of exposing the structure. The first stone was uncovered at 11 a.m., the second at noon. By 1 p.m., the roof was fully visible, and the weight of decades was pressing down on everyone present. "My God," James said, running his hands over the carved symbols. "How is this not in any database?" "Because someone didn't want it to be," Alina said. She was looking at Sharon. "Because people have been protecting this, keeping it hidden for nearly 100 years." The dig continued through Monday and Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, the metal door was fully exposed, its lead seal still intact. James brought in equipment to carefully remove the seal without damaging what lay beneath. And then at 2:47 p.m. on Wednesday afternoon, the door was open. Inside was darkness. Inside was history. Inside were answers to questions the town had never thought to ask. And standing at the fence line, watching with an expression of absolute triumph, was Pat Hodgkins. The chamber was exactly 10 feet underground, accessed through a narrow stone staircase carved directly into the earth. James Morrison descended first with professional lighting equipment, while Alina and Sharon waited above, holding their breath. 3 minutes passed in silence. Then James's voice came up from below, echoing strangely off the ancient stone. "You need to see this." The interior of the chamber was larger than expected, perhaps 30 feet across, with a ceiling that rose 12 feet at its apex. The walls were constructed of precisely cut stone, fitted together without mortar, in a technique that suggested expertise and time. And the walls were covered, completely, comprehensively covered, with carved symbols and images. Alina descended next, and Sharon heard her gasp audibly. "These are Mazatic," Alina said, her voice trembling. "No, wait, there's something older, pre-Mazatic, pre-Columbian for sure, but the style suggests. James, I need you to photograph everything, everything." Sharon stood at the top of the stairs, afraid to go down, afraid to see. She could hear the graduate students, Lucas and Sarah, descending, their excitement palpable despite their attempts at professional restraint. "There's an altar," Sarah called up. "And artifacts. Sharon, there are things here that shouldn't exist." At 3:15 p.m., Sharon descended into the chamber. The first thing that struck her was the air. It was cool, dry, perfectly preserved. The lead seal had worked exactly as intended. The second thing was the smell, earth and time and something else, something almost like incense, residual from centuries ago. The walls of the chamber were a historical text written in stone. The carvings documented something, a migration possibly, or a settlement. Figures moved across the stone in procession, carrying objects, performing rituals. There were astronomical markers, the sun and moon rendered in geometric precision. There were agricultural symbols, corn, beans, other plants. There were what looked like maps, the landscape around Millbrook Heights, rendered in a style that predated European contact by centuries. "This is a ceremonial space," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is sacred. Someone, an indigenous people, clearly Mazatic or a pre-contact civilization, established a settlement here. They built this chamber. And then—" He trailed off, looking at the disturbed layers, at the way the chamber seemed to end abruptly. "It was sealed," Alina finished. "Deliberately sealed. They sealed it themselves, or someone forced them to." On the altar, a raised platform of stone, precisely carved, lay objects, pottery intact and beautiful, tools, what looked like ceremonial items rendered in gold and jade, and bones, small bones, arranged with ritual precision. A burial, Sharon realized. A final offering, perhaps, a goodbye. "We need to document everything," James said. He was already photographing, already taking samples, already moving into the professional mode of someone trained in this work. "Elena, we need to get the university involved. We need formal excavation protocols. This is too significant for anything less." "How old do you think it is?" Sharon asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Based on the pottery style and the architectural technique, I'd estimate anywhere from 700 to 900 years. Pre-Columbian, definitely. Possibly one of the last major settlements in this region before the Spanish arrived. So this was established before Europeans ever set foot on this continent," Sharon said slowly. "Long before," Elena confirmed. "This was a thriving civilization, and someone buried it, literally and figuratively." The team worked until sunset, carefully documenting everything without removing anything. James was adamant. This was now an archaeological site, and everything they did had to follow proper protocol. But the photographs were already shocking enough. Sharon watched as the images accumulated on the laptop. Walls of carved history, artifacts of stunning craftsmanship, evidence of a civilization that had been living in this location for generations before Millbrook Heights, before America, before the entire European conception of this land. At 6 p.m., Elena's phone rang. She stepped outside to take the call and returned 5 minutes later looking troubled. "That was the university," she said. "Word is already getting out. Social media, blogs, someone photographed the excavation and started posting about it. The story is spreading. Underground archaeological site discovered in suburban neighborhood. It's about to become a very public matter." James looked grim. "That means we have maybe 24 hours before this becomes a media circus and a political issue." "Political?" Sharon asked. "Everything is political," James said. "This discovery could have implications for land rights, historical narrative, indigenous representation. There are going to be people who want to suppress this, and people who want to exploit it, and people who want to do the right thing and will be drowned out by the other two groups. You need to prepare yourself for that." As if on cue, Sharon's phone buzzed. A text from Michael. "What the hell is happening at our house? I'm seeing pictures online." Then another, "Call me." Then, "Sharon, what did you do?" Sharon didn't call him back immediately. Instead, she stood in her backyard as the sun set, watching the ancient chamber glow softly in the archaeological lights, watching history being exposed and documented, and felt the full weight of what she'd begun to move. Her family had kept this secret for nearly 100 years. Her grandmother had buried it because she was afraid. Her mother had carried that fear her entire life. Her sister had run from it. And Sharon had, by opening the earth, exposed everyone and everything that had been protected. Pat Hodgkins appeared at the fence at 7:15 p.m. She was dressed for evening, carrying a glass of wine, moving with the casual entitlement of someone who assumed all neighborhood business was her business. Behind her, Sharon could see other neighbors gathering, drawn by the trucks, the equipment, the excitement of something unprecedented happening in their orderly suburban space. "So this is what you were hiding," Pat said, looking at the exposed chamber with something that might have been satisfaction or might have been hunger. Sharon wasn't sure. "This is what you didn't want anyone to know about." "It's an archaeological site," Sharon said flatly. "It predates the neighborhood by several hundred years." "An archaeological site that you were concealing, that your family was concealing. That makes you part of covering up an important piece of history." "My family was protecting it." "From what?" Pat took a sip of wine. "From whom? This is public history, Sharon. This belongs to everyone. You had no right to bury it." Elena stepped forward. "Actually, the property owner has every right to manage their private property. What Sharon has done is voluntarily expose an important site. That's the ethical choice." Pat's expression hardened. Ethics and rules are different things, and the rules about archaeological sites are that they need to be reported to the state board. They need to be investigated officially. They need to be protected, which means this property is probably going to be tied up for years. You do understand that, yes? You've essentially just put your house in limbo. Sharon hadn't thought about that. She watched Pat's face, watched the pleasure settle into her features, understood that her neighbor had just realized the full implications of what had happened. "This is going to be wonderful for the neighborhood," Pat continued. "Historical significance, media attention, tour probably, educational programs, everything I've been trying to build for Millbrook Heights will be accelerated by this discovery." "You seem very pleased," Alina said coldly. "I'm pleased that the truth is emerging, even if it took trespassing and excavation to accomplish it." "You didn't trespass," Sharon said. Pat turned to her with a smile. "Not yet, but I will eventually. I'll have every right to. This is now a matter of public historical significance. The state will be involved. Archaeologists will be involved. Nobody will care that there's a fence anymore." Pat left before Sharon could respond, leaving her wine glass on the fence post like a calling card. The media descended on Millbrook Heights by Thursday morning. Channel 7 News was first, followed quickly by regional press, bloggers, podcasters, and independent journalists. By noon, there were satellite trucks on residential streets. By 1 p.m., a small crowd of curious onlookers had formed at the perimeter of Sharon's property, held back by temporary fencing that Alina had arranged through the township. James and his team worked frantically to document everything before the site became a media spectacle. The university had authorized formal excavation protocols. The State Archaeological Board had sent an official representative. A tribal liaison for the Mazatek Nation was en route. Everything was becoming official, formal, removed from Sharon's personal domain. Michael called at noon on Thursday. "I'm coming home," he said without preamble. "I'm on a flight this afternoon. We need to talk about this." "Talk about what?" "Opening a historical chamber." "About making a unilateral decision about our property without consulting me. About apparently conducting a major archaeological excavation on land that we own jointly. About creating a media circus out of our neighborhood." "The media came on their own." "Don't be naive, Sharon. You called archaeologists. You invited scientists. You allowed excavation equipment. You made a choice to expose this, and you did it alone." The phone line crackled with anger. Real anger, not the frustrated complaint tone Michael usually deployed when they disagreed about things. "My family kept this secret." "I don't care about your family's secrets. I care about my house and my privacy and my wife making major decisions without me." Michael hung up. Sharon stood in her kitchen, listening to the silence, understanding that something in her marriage had just shifted. She'd made a choice, and that choice had consequences that extended far beyond archaeology. By Friday morning, the story had gone national. "Ancient indigenous settlement discovered beneath New Jersey suburban neighborhood," read one headline. "Archaeological mystery emerges, pre-Columbian site in Millbrook Heights," read another. And then, from a less scrupulous source, "Woman uncovers family secret, generations-old cover-up of historic site revealed." That headline named Sharon specifically. It detailed her family history, her mother's death, the mystery of why her family had kept the site sealed. Someone had called the journalists with the personal details. Sharon had a fairly good idea who, but she had no proof. Pat, however, seemed to be everywhere. She'd given an interview to the local news about the community's pride in its diverse history. She'd been photographed showing media representatives the site. She'd positioned herself as the neighborhood representative, the voice of reason and community spirit, when asked about the excavation and its implications. "This is wonderful for Millbrook Heights," Pat said in an interview that appeared in the regional paper. "It shows that our community can be progressive, open to historical discovery. I've been advocating for historical preservation in this neighborhood for years. Finally, we're getting the recognition we deserve." There was no mention of her trespassing, no mention of her harassment of Sharon, no mention of her role in pushing this exposure forward. She'd simply inserted herself into the narrative and claimed credit. By Friday afternoon, James pulled Sharon aside in her kitchen, away from the media circus outside. "There's something you need to see," he said. He had a tablet with him with high-resolution photographs of the chamber's walls. He zoomed in on one particular section, on one particular series of carvings. "These figures," he said, pointing. "This is a narrative sequence. It shows the occupation of the site over time, but look here at the end of the sequence. Do you see what's happening?" Sharon leaned closer. The final carvings showed figures with a different appearance, taller, different facial structure, different clothing. "European," she said. Those are European figures. Yes, and based on the style, based on the techniques, this was carved around the time of first European contact. Maybe late 1400s. The chamber's inhabitants documented their own encounter with colonialism. They carved it into the walls. They recorded their own history. They knew what was coming. They knew it meant the end of their way of life here. And so they sealed this chamber. They preserved it. They made sure that the truth would survive even if they didn't. Sharon felt something break inside her chest. The people who had built this place, who had lived here and thrived here, had understood they were about to lose everything. And instead of fighting or running, they'd simply sealed the evidence. They'd made a record, and then they'd walked away. The Mazitic Nation is sending official representatives tomorrow, James continued. They want to perform a blessing ceremony before we proceed with further excavation. They want to honor the ancestors who built this place. I think you should be there. For what? I'm not Mazitic. I'm not indigenous to this land. I'm the person whose family covered this up. You're the person who had the courage to uncover it, James said. You're the person who chose truth over comfort. Sharon wasn't sure that was fair. She'd chosen truth because her family's secret had become untenable. She'd chosen truth because Pat Hodgkins had forced her hand. She hadn't chosen this out of noble intention. She'd chosen it because she'd been cornered. Michael arrived home Friday night. He looked exhausted, angry, and utterly bewildered by the scene that greeted him. News trucks on residential streets, crowds of people, security barriers, and the organized chaos of an active archaeological site. "This is insane," he said, standing in their kitchen, looking out at the excavation with the expression of a man watching his life be dismantled. "This is genuinely insane, Sharon. Do you understand what you've done to us? I've uncovered history that my family buried. You've destroyed our privacy. You've turned our home into a tourist attraction. You've made us the subject of national news stories. He gestured helplessly at the scene. I can't be here. I can't deal with this right now. I'm going back to Dallas. I'm going to stay with Tom. I don't know when I'm coming back." "Michael, wait. I need time to process what you've done, and you need to figure out what you're going to do next, because right now all I feel is betrayed." He packed a bag in 15 minutes and was on a flight back to Dallas by 10 p.m. Sharon stood alone in her kitchen, watching the excavation lights illuminate the backyard in an eerie glow, and understood that she had sacrificed not just the secret, but her marriage in the process. Saturday morning, the Mazitic representatives arrived. There were 5 of them, led by Maria Santos, a woman in her 60s with a quiet authority that filled the space she occupied. She approached the chamber with reverence, accompanied by a younger man who seemed to be her son, and 3 others whose roles Sharon didn't immediately understand. Maria knelt at the entrance to the chamber and rested her forehead against the stone. "My ancestors," she said softly, speaking in English though her accent suggested her primary language might be something else. "After all these years, you have called us home." Elena and James remained respectful distance away, offering cultural space for what Maria was doing. Sharon stood with them, feeling like an outsider at her own property in her own history. Maria rose and turned to face the assembled group: James, Elena, various archaeologists and students, and Sharon. "This place is sacred," Maria said. "This place holds the memory of our people. We knew this site was somewhere in this region, but we had lost the specific location. Our oral history spoke of a place that was sealed, protected, waiting for the day when it would be safe to open it again." "How long have you known about this?" Elena asked. "Since the Spanish arrived," Maria said simply. "My ancestors left records in our oral tradition. They documented where the sacred sites had been sealed, where the records were kept. Over the centuries, we have tried to find them, to recover them. Some we have found, some remain lost, but this one has been protected by the land itself." She looked directly at Sharon, and by a family that may not have understood what they were protecting, but who protected it nonetheless. Sharon felt tears prick her eyes. For the first time since opening the chamber, she understood that her family's secrecy had not been a betrayal of history. It had been a stewardship. Her grandmother, her mother, even her own instinct to let the eastern corner of the property remain hidden, all of it had been a form of protection. "What happens now?" Sharon asked. "Now," Maria said, "we honor what is here, we acknowledge the ancestors. We study it, learn from it, make sure their story is not lost again. And then we decide as a community, as a people, what the right course of action is for this place. The blessing ceremony took place that evening, at sunset, in the chamber itself. There were songs in a language that Sharon didn't understand, but felt in her bones nonetheless. There were offerings placed on the altar, corn, water, flowers, objects of spiritual significance. There was a moment of silence that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. And then it was complete. The ancestors had been acknowledged. The chamber, sealed for nearly 400 years, had been opened to the people it belonged to. The article appeared on a local news blog on Sunday morning. Controversial trespasser drove archaeological discovery. The subheading was more specific. HOA President Patricia Hodgkin's actions led to excavation at Millbrook Heights site. In the article, an anonymous source, though the implications were clear, explained that Pat's trespassing and boundary violations had prompted Sharon to excavate her property, proving that Pat's harassment had been justified all along. The article quoted the source saying that Patricia Hodgkins deserved credit for her persistence in maintaining community standards and her unwillingness to let boundaries be broken without investigation. Pat had done it. She'd taken her trespassing, her stalking, her harassment, and reframed it as the catalyst for an important discovery. She'd inserted herself into the narrative as the hero. Elena found Sharon reading the article on her phone, sitting on the patio, watching the morning light catch the excavation site. "Don't respond," Elena said immediately. "That's the first thing she wants. She wants you angry, engaged, giving her more attention. Don't do it. She violated my privacy for months, and now she's being celebrated for it." She's being celebrated by one anonymous blogger, probably someone in the neighborhood who already agreed with her to begin with. The real media, the actual reporters covering this story, understand the distinction between Pat's trespassing and your discovery. The record will reflect that correctly. But Sharon knew something Elena didn't. The record could say whatever it wanted. The truth was already being written by people with the most convincing narrative. And Pat Hodgkins had a very convincing narrative. She cared so much about community standards that she was willing to sacrifice her reputation to uncover the truth. By Tuesday, Pat had been interviewed on 2 local news segments and had given a statement to the regional newspaper. In each case, she positioned her trespassing as a civil disobedience, taking action when official channels weren't working. She was careful not to frame it as stalking or harassment. She framed it as persistence, concern, civic duty. "I was simply trying to maintain community standards," she said in one interview. "When I noticed inconsistencies in how one property was maintained, I felt obligated to investigate. That investigation led to the discovery of something extraordinary. Sometimes, doing the right thing requires stepping outside conventional boundaries." The reporter didn't ask her about Sharon's explicit requests to stop trespassing. The reporter didn't mention the photographs she'd left on the doormat. The reporter didn't interrogate the timeline or implications of her actions. Pat had successfully rewritten the story. She was no longer the antagonist. She was the agent of discovery. On Wednesday, Sharon received an official letter from the HOA. She opened it to find a formal notification that the HOA board had voted to posthumously honor Patricia Hodgkins for her contributions to the community and to the archaeological discovery at Millbrook Heights. They'd commissioned a small bronze plaque to be placed in a central neighborhood location. The plaque would read, "In recognition of community dedication and historic preservation." Sharon actually laughed when she read it. The absurdity was so complete, so perfectly aligned with everything she'd come to understand about how narratives get constructed, that she couldn't do anything else. Elena, reading the letter, looked furious. "This is unbelievable." "Is it?" Sharon asked. "Think about it from their perspective. They have the HOA president who pursued a mystery in the neighborhood. That pursuit led to an important discovery. From the HOA's point of view, this reflects well on them. They're protecting their investment." "By dishonoring you." "By dishonoring the truth," Sharon corrected. "But what's the truth matter when a simpler story is available?" Michael called on Thursday. He'd been away for 5 days, and his voice on the phone was different, calmer but also colder, more distant. "I've been talking to a lawyer," he said without preamble, "about our options." Sharon's stomach dropped. "Options, Michael?" "Options regarding the property. Options regarding whether we want to maintain ownership now that it's been declared an official archaeological site. There are going to be restrictions. There will be ongoing excavation. Tourism, possibly. The whole dynamic of what it means to own this house has changed. I know that. Do you? Because it seems like you made these changes without understanding the implications, without considering my stake in this. Your stake was keeping a 400-year-old secret buried in our backyard. My stake was having a home and a marriage that wasn't under constant scrutiny by the entire state of New Jersey. Yes, apparently that was too much to ask. They talked for another 20 minutes, circling around the same points, unable to find purchase. Michael was hurting, and he was expressing that hurt as anger about the property, about the discovery, about Sharon's choice. Sharon understood that what he really couldn't forgive was the loss of the simple life they'd had, and she couldn't apologize for something that had felt in the moment like the only ethical choice. I'm going to stay in Dallas for a while longer, Michael said, ending the call. I think we both need some space. After he hung up, Sharon sat in the kitchen of the house they'd built their marriage in, and felt very much alone. The Mazatek Nation formally requested stewardship of the site on Friday. The request came through official channels, submitted to the State Archaeological Board and to the township. The nation argued that the chamber was sacred indigenous property, that it contained artifacts and remains of cultural and spiritual significance, and that control of the site should be transferred to them for appropriate protection and study. The township had no authority to approve or deny this. It would be decided at the state level, with input from various legal and cultural experts. But the request triggered a cascade of political reactions. Some local community members supported it, arguing that indigenous peoples had the moral and legal right to their sacred sites. Others opposed it, arguing that the site was part of the neighborhood's cultural heritage and should remain accessible to the public. The debate played out on social media, in local news coverage, in community forums. And Pat Hodgkins positioned herself directly in the center of the conflict. She gave interviews arguing for community access to the site. She started a petition titled Preserving Millbrook Heights Heritage, arguing that the archaeological discoveries should be preserved for public benefit. She carefully avoided framing it as opposition to the Mazatek Nation. She was just advocating for the neighborhood's collective stake in the discovery. In doing so, she managed to channel a certain percentage of people's discomfort with the transition of control. Discomfort that, if examined honestly, was rooted in racial and cultural attitudes that nobody wanted to voice directly. She gave them a way to express that discomfort without confronting it. The petition gathered 340 signatures in 2 days. Maria Santos came to see Sharon on Saturday morning. She brought tea and sat across from Sharon at her kitchen table, looking at her with eyes that seemed to see deeper than the surface. I want you to know something, Maria said. Your family kept this chamber safe. Whatever their reasons, whatever their fears, they protected it. That matters. We will not forget that. Thank you, Sharon said, because she didn't know what else to say. But I also want to prepare you for what comes next, Maria continued. There will be conflict over this site. Some people will want to preserve it as a public monument. Some will want it sealed again, hidden, protected from tourism and damage. Some will want it destroyed so the question goes away entirely. There will be voices pulling in every direction. And you, because you are the property owner and the person who opened it, you will be held responsible for whatever outcome occurs. I didn't open it to cause problems. I opened it because the truth needed to come out, Maria finished. Yes, I know, but there is always a price for truth. Someone has to pay it. In this case, I think that will be you. What should I do? What you've already done. Be honest. Be willing to face the consequences of your choices. Support the people who want to do right by this place, even if that means standing against the tide of convenience. Maria left Sharon with that, and with the tea, which had cooled slightly but was still warm enough to hold. The legal battle began the following week. The state had appointed a special commission to oversee the disposition of the site. The commission included archaeologists, legal experts, tribal representatives, and community members. Arguments were presented about ownership, about cultural significance, about public access rights, about historical preservation. And in the middle of all of it, Pat launched her public campaign. She held community meetings in her home, inviting neighbors to discuss what Millbrook Heights wanted from this discovery. She gave interviews to conservative news outlets that presented the dispute as a conflict between indigenous rights and American community interests. She carefully constructed a narrative in which she was defending the neighborhood's stake against external pressure. The local news covered it extensively, and because the coverage was balanced, presenting all sides as equally valid, it gave the appearance of a legitimate controversy. It created the sense that this was actually a difficult question with real merit on both sides. It was brilliant political maneuvering, and it made Sharon's skin crawl. On a Tuesday afternoon, Sharon found Pat standing at the fence line, looking into the excavation site. "It's quite something," Pat said without turning around. "History right here in our neighborhood. I have to say I'm proud of what this community has accomplished in bringing this to light." "You're proud?" Sharon tried to keep the edge out of her voice. "You trespassed on my property for months. You harassed me. I advocated for transparency. I believed something was being hidden, and I was right. The fact that what was being hidden turned out to be archaeology rather than something nefarious just means my methods were validated. Your methods were violations of my privacy." Pat turned to face her, and her expression was almost pitying. "Sharon, in the end, privacy is just another word for hiding things, and you weren't actually interested in privacy, you were interested in protecting a secret. I just helped you do what you deep down wanted to do, which was expose it." "That's not what I wanted." "No, then why did you call the archaeologists? Why did you allow the excavation? Why did you cooperate with the discovery process if you wanted to keep it hidden?" Sharon opened her mouth, then closed it. Because Pat had just articulated something she'd been avoiding, that deep down, Sharon had wanted this exposed. That the secret had been too heavy to carry alone, and Pat's trespassing had been an excuse, almost a permission. "You're a problem," Pat continued. "You were keeping a historical treasure locked away in your backyard. You were depriving the community of its own heritage. Yes, I trespassed. Yes, I violated your privacy. But I did it in service of something larger than your personal comfort, and that makes it justified." "That's not how ethics work." "No," Pat agreed, "but it's how politics works, and politics, not ethics, is what determines outcomes." The State Commission made its preliminary recommendation in early December. The chamber would be jointly managed by the Mazatek Nation and the township, with ongoing archaeological study and research. Public access would be limited and controlled. The site would be designated as both a historic landmark and a sacred indigenous location. The property owner, Sharon, would retain nominal ownership of the land, but would have limited control over how the site was used. It was a compromise, not perfect, not satisfying to anyone completely, but fair to most stakeholders. What it meant for Sharon was that her backyard, the place where she'd sunbathed, where she'd read, where she'd hid, was now effectively public property, managed by committees and governed by regulations. Michael's response was to file for legal separation. He sent the papers through his lawyer with a brief note. "I can't do this. I can't be married to someone willing to sacrifice everything for a principle. I'm not built that way." Sharon read the papers 3 times, trying to find something in them that felt like a mistake, like something that could be fixed with a conversation. But the language was clear, the positions were clear, and Michael's resolve was apparent. She called him, needing to hear his voice, needing to understand if this was really happening. "Are we really doing this?" she asked. "I've already consulted with lawyers," Michael said flatly. "I'm not interested in years of litigation. I'll sell you my share of the house. You keep it, you deal with the archaeological circus, you live with the consequences. But I'm done." "Michael, please. Don't try to convince me that this was right. Don't try to make me understand your reasoning. I understand it perfectly. You chose history over your marriage. You chose a principle over your partnership. You chose to expose your family's secret without considering my stake in your family. And now you have to live with what that choice cost." December arrived with snow and carolers and neighborhood decorations, all of it an obscene contrast to the emotional devastation happening inside houses. Sharon went through the motions. She hung lights, she bought a tree, she decorated her home as if it were still a place where normal people lived normal lives, but everything felt like performance. Michael had gotten an apartment in Dallas and was filing divorce papers. The State Commission was implementing its recommendations. The Mazatek Nation was planning an opening ceremony for the chamber in January, and Sharon was expected to participate. And every single thing she looked at, the eastern corner of her yard, the new structures being built to protect the chamber, the business cards that locals kept leaving on her fence from people wanting to buy her property, reminded her that her choices had consequences that extended far beyond her own suffering. Alina came to visit a week before Christmas. She arrived with wine and cookies and the particular gentleness that people deploy when they're trying not to make you feel worse than you already do. "How are you holding up?" Alina asked, sitting on Sharon's couch looking at the half-decorated living room. "I'm not sure how to answer that honestly." "Then just answer it dishonestly. Tell me you're fine, lie to me, I'll appreciate it." Sharon laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd had in weeks. "I'm fine." "You're terrible, you look like you haven't slept, Michael left. Your marriage is ending, and there's a persistent media interest in your life. You're the opposite of fine." "Thank you for being honest. That's what friends are for. Also, I brought something." Alina pulled out her phone and opened an email. "The university wants to do a documentary about the discovery. 5-part series. They want interviews with you with James with tribal representatives. It will tell the full story, including what your family did, why they protected the site, everything." "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because they're offering compensation. Not a lot, but meaningful, enough to pay a good portion of your legal fees for the divorce, enough to give you breathing room. And because it might help you reframe what happened. Right now, you're seeing this as a loss. The documentary could help you see it as a complicated truth." Sharon didn't want a documentary. She didn't want to examine the story any further, didn't want to pick through the choices and consequences and try to find meaning in the wreckage. But she understood Alina's point. Refusing the documentary wouldn't undo the story. Other people would tell it anyway. At least this way, Sharon could have some control over the narrative. "I'll do it," Sharon said. The Mazitic Nation's opening ceremony for the chamber took place on January 15th, a cold, clear Saturday, with dignitaries, media, community members, and descendants of the original inhabitants gathered in Millbrook Heights to witness the official acknowledgement of what had been hidden for so long. Maria Santos led the ceremony, speaking in English and then in her native language. She explained the significance of the site, the history of its sealing, the journey of her people to find what had been lost. She spoke about the family that had protected it, about how sometimes protection comes in unexpected forms, about how history is never simple or pure. Then she turned to Sharon, who stood to the side, not wanting to be the center of attention but unable to escape it. "This person's family kept this place safe," Maria said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "For nearly 100 years they held the boundary. They did not understand what they were protecting, but they protected it nonetheless. That protection allowed us to reclaim what belongs to us. That protection honored our ancestors, and for that we are grateful." The crowd applauded. Camera flashes went off. Sharon felt tears on her face and didn't bother to wipe them away. After the ceremony, a woman approached her. She was young, maybe 30, with indigenous features and warm eyes. "I'm Dr. Lisa Martinez," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Mazitic, and I'm one of the leading scholars in indigenous history for this region. I wanted to thank you personally for what you've done." "I haven't done anything intentionally," Sharon said. "That's not true. You faced a choice between comfort and truth, and you chose truth even when it cost you. That's intentional, that's brave." "It doesn't feel brave. It feels like I destroyed my marriage." "Maybe those things aren't mutually exclusive," Lisa suggested. "Maybe sometimes doing the right thing destroys things that needed to be destroyed. I don't know your marriage, but I know that someone who values truth enough to sacrifice for it is someone worth knowing." They talked for another 20 minutes about history and family and the ways that the past reaches into the present. By the time Lisa left, Sharon felt something shift. Not forgiveness exactly, but a small shift toward acceptance. Pat Hodgkins did not attend the opening ceremony, but she was very visible in the weeks that followed, giving interviews about how the community needed to prepare itself for the implications of the discovery, how outside interests were trying to control local decisions, how the township needed to stand firm against pressure to change their way of life. She was careful never to say anything openly discriminatory, but she created an atmosphere of subtle resistance, of insinuation, of the implication that the Mazitic Nation's involvement was somehow a threat to the neighborhood's identity. The national news picked up on the story. "Indigenous reclamation meets community resistance in New Jersey town." The framing suggested a genuine conflict, when what was really happening was that Pat was successfully mobilizing people's baseline discomfort into organized opposition. By early February, a petition had been started calling for the township to reconsider the site's management structure and prioritize community input. The petition had 620 signatures. Sharon, reading the news coverage, felt something in her harden. She'd paid a price for truth. And Pat Hodgkins, the person who had violated Sharon's privacy, who had harassed her, who had orchestrated the exposure of the chamber, was being treated as a voice of reason and community protection. The injustice of it was almost physical. Elena called Sharon the morning Pat's face appeared on the cover of the local business journal. Patricia Hodgkins, the community voice keeping Millbrook Heights grounded, Elena read over the phone. They did an interview about her vision for the neighborhood, her commitment to preserving community values. There's zero mention of the trespassing, zero mention of the harassment, just a positive profile of a woman who cares deeply about her neighborhood. I know, Sharon said quietly. You knew this would happen. I suspected, I wasn't sure, but yes. And what are you going to do about it? Sharon had spent the past week thinking about exactly that question. She had evidence of Pat's trespassing, the photographs Pat had left on her doormat. She had evidence of the attempted gate tampering. She had her own testimony about months of surveillance and boundary violations. She could go to the police, file a formal complaint, press charges for stalking and harassment. She could call the local news, tell them her side of the story. She could fight back, make sure that Pat's narrative didn't go unchallenged. But what would that accomplish? What would that do except drag her deeper into conflict, turn this into a personal vendetta rather than a principle? Nothing, Sharon said. I'm not going to do anything. You're not going to, Sharon. Pat is rewriting history. She's making herself the hero of your story. Let her, the truth is available to anyone who looks for it. The records are there. The timeline is clear. If people choose not to see it, then that's on them. But I'm not going to spend the rest of my life fighting Pat Hodgkins for credit for something that doesn't belong to either of us. It belongs to the chamber. It belongs to the ancestors. It belongs to history, and that's bigger than my ego. Elena was quiet on the other end of the line. Then, that's very mature of you. Or I'm just too tired to fight anymore. Maybe those things are the same. The divorce was finalized in March. Michael and Sharon managed to be civil enough through the process, splitting assets reasonably, agreeing on terms, trying not to weaponize the marriage's dissolution against each other. But civility couldn't mask the fundamental reality. They had become incompatible, not because they'd changed, but because Sharon had revealed a part of herself that Michael couldn't accept. He'd wanted a wife who would prioritize comfort, stability, and peace. Sharon had turned out to be someone willing to sacrifice all three for a principle. Once that became clear, there was no going back. On the day the divorce was finalized, Michael called her to say goodbye. I want you to know, he said, that I still think what you did was wrong. I still think you should have consulted me. I still think you destroyed what we had for something that doesn't matter as much as the life we'd built. I know, Sharon said. But I also want to know that I don't hate you. I'm sad, I'm angry, but I don't hate you. And I hope that eventually you won't hate yourself either. After they hung up, Sharon sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where they'd had countless ordinary conversations, and allowed herself to grieve. The documentary aired in April, in 5 one-hour episodes, on a premium streaming service that guaranteed significant viewership. Part 1 covered the discovery. Part 2 covered the chamber itself and its historical significance. Part 3 covered the Mazatic Nation's reclamation efforts. Part 4 covered the conflict and political resistance. And Part 5 covered Sharon's family history and her decision to open the chamber. In Part 5, Sharon gave an interview that was honest, painful, and vulnerable. She talked about her mother's fear, her grandmother's secrecy, her own instinct to maintain the boundary. She talked about Pat's harassment and how it had been the catalyst, even if Pat hadn't intended it that way, for her to finally confront what she'd been protecting. She talked about the cost of that choice, the marriage she'd lost, the privacy she'd surrendered. And then she said something that surprised even her. If I had it to do over again, knowing what I know now about the cost, I'm still not sure I'd do it differently, and I'm not sure that's a sign of strength, but it's the truth. The documentary received critical acclaim. It was nominated for several awards. It introduced the story of the chamber to a national audience in a way that was nuanced, complex, and fair. And it made Pat Hodgkins furious. Pat's response came in the form of a letter to the township, the state, and the media, laying out a detailed timeline of Sharon's negligent stewardship of the site, her reckless decision to excavate, and her bias against community input in the chamber's management. The letter was remarkably well written, probably professionally written, and it reframed Pat's trespassing as reasonable concern about property maintenance and her attempts to penetrate the gate as standard boundary verification. It was a masterclass in rhetorical manipulation, and it almost worked. The township council, facing pressure, decided to revisit the site management structure. The Mazatic Nation, sensing the potential for further conflict, began making concessions. Archaeological work that had been planned was delayed pending community input sessions. In other words, Pat had effectively weaponized the democratic process to slow down everything she disagreed with. Sharon met with Lisa Martinez and Maria Santos in early May to discuss the situation. They met at a coffee shop in a neighboring town where they wouldn't be recognized, and Maria laid out what they were facing with brutal clarity. "She's trying to delay us," Maria said. "Every month of delay gives her supporters time to organize, gives her time to construct narratives, gives her time to make this into a permanent political struggle. She's not going to win. The law is on our side, the historical record is on our side. But she might be able to make this so painful that we stop trying." "What do you need from me?" Sharon asked. "We need a united front," Lisa said. "We need you to be willing to push back publicly, to continue telling your story, to make it clear that you support the nation's stewardship of the site. Right now, people are confused about the narrative. They see a conflict between you and Pat, and they think it's about ego. We need to make it clear that it's about respect for indigenous sovereignty." Sharon understood what they were asking. They were asking her to re-enter the conflict, to make this about something larger than her personal suffering. They were asking her to use her voice and her story to support something that mattered. "Yes," Sharon said, "I'll do it." The community meeting was held on a Thursday evening in June at the Millbrook Heights Recreation Center. It was packed, nearly 400 people, with supporters of both the Mazatic Nation's site stewardship and those who supported Pat's call for community input. The township had organized it as an attempt to build consensus, though everyone in the room understood it was really a chance for Pat to mobilize her base and for the resistance to consolidate. Sharon, Lisa, Maria, and Alina sat at a long table at the front of the room, facing the assembled crowd. The moderator was a township official named John Patterson, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Pat had dressed carefully for the occasion, pressed blazer, carefully styled hair, the appearance of someone in control. She sat with a group of supporters at one side of the room, composed and ready. "We're here tonight," John began, "to discuss the future management of the archaeological site on Maple Road and to ensure that the community has a voice in decisions that affect our neighborhood. I believe everyone has reasonable concerns, and I believe we can find common ground. So let's start with statements from both sides, and then we'll open it to community input." Maria spoke first. She talked about the chamber's significance to the Mazatic Nation, about the cultural and spiritual meaning of the site, about the importance of indigenous peoples having control over their own heritage. She was eloquent, compelling, and perfect. Then Pat spoke. She was brilliant, Sharon had to admit. Pat didn't attack the Mazatic Nation directly. She said all the right things about respecting indigenous heritage, but she carefully emphasized the need for community partnership, for local input, for making sure we don't lose sight of the neighborhood's own stake in this discovery. She framed her concerns not as opposition to indigenous rights, but as support for a more inclusive decision-making process. And then John asked Sharon if she wanted to make a statement. Sharon hadn't planned to speak at first, but watching Pat work the room, watching her carefully construct a narrative of reasonable concern, Sharon felt something crystallize. She stood up and the room quieted. "I've tried to stay out of this conflict," Sharon said, her voice carrying through the room. "I've tried to let the process work, to trust that democratic institutions would do the right thing. But I need to say something clearly. What Pat Hodgkins is doing is not about community input. It's about undermining the legitimacy of indigenous stewardship." Pat's expression didn't change, but her posture stiffened. "For 8 months," Sharon continued, Pat trespassed on my property. She left photographs of my house. She tried to penetrate my fence. She was obsessed with finding something on my property that she believed I was hiding. And when I excavated the site, when I discovered what was underneath, she instantly reframed her trespassing as civic concern. She claimed credit for a discovery that had nothing to do with her. And now she's using that false narrative to slow down the Mazatic nation's ability to access and protect their own sacred site.